Friends, good evening and welcome to Park Avenue Synagogue. We are honored to host this important dialogue here. This week, synagogues across the world will read from the Torah, the Parsha, the portion of Lech Lecha, where we learn of the birth of Yishmael, and next week we will read about the birth of Isaac. Two sons, two nations. Our timing for this dialogue is a nice touch this evening, and if that were all, as we would say, dayenu, that would be enough. The Torah says more, though. It says that God spoke to Abram, telling Abram to walk in God's ways and to be tamim. The King James translation of the word tamim is perfect. You should walk before me and be perfect, which is an unrealistic demand. We might understand this word to mean that you should be whole. Come to me with your whole self, the parts you're proud of, the parts that are challenging, imperfect, the parts that we wish were different. It's in this spirit I would like to begin this evening, recognizing that no one is perfect, that we come together here recognizing that this is a challenging conversation, and yet we are here with our whole selves, committed to the future, committed to coexistence, and committed to peace. Yossi, I know the intention of this book was that it be read by your Palestinian neighbors. There have been many public and I suspect private responses to you. Tonight we will hear some of those responses, and that, my friends, is a blessing. Yossi, I'd like to turn it over to you to start us off and to frame the evening.
So good evening, friends. Really delighted to be back here. It really is, for me, a kind of homecoming. My gratitude is to the two of you, to Yusef and Rowan, for being partners, for being willing and ready to take up the hard and necessary conversation, really for your courage and for your goodwill. And I'm honored to be on this stage with you. I'm honored to be your friend, even though there's a bit of an age gap between us. But I truly, truly feel a deep sense of friendship with you both. A few words about this project, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and I deliberately use the word project rather than book, because when I conceived of it, I saw the book as really a first stage. And the book is a series of letters written to an anonymous Palestinian neighbor with the invitation for real Palestinian neighbors to respond. And in this book, I try to tell something of my own personal story, what brought me to live in Israel now nearly 4 decades, and what brought the Jewish people home, to use our language, and inviting Palestinians to tell me their story. And the reason why I emphasize story is because just as neither people is going to disappear, neither narrative is going to disappear either. And the book was offered for free downloading in Arabic. It was translated into Arabic, released in Arabic the same day as it was released in English, and symbolically that was very important for me. And the latest edition, this paperback edition of Letters, contains a new 50-page epilogue of the responses that I received back from my Palestinian neighbors, including, and for me, really two of my favorite responses were from Rowan and Yusef. And their letters appear in the new epilogue as well. I've also been meeting quietly with groups of young Palestinians in the West Bank who have read the book. We've been having quiet, intense conversations. So when I refer to this book as a project, it has now entered into the next stage, in which this panel for me is truly a highlight. And the reason that I wrote this book, and the reason why I insisted on focusing on my story, my people's story, is because my understanding of this conflict is that this is a war over intangibles, not lines on the map or settlements or holy places. Those are all significant issues. But ultimately, this is a conflict over intangibles. The right to exist, the right to define oneself as a people, the right to be regarded as an indigenous people, and that goes for both sides. And so for me, the word indigenous, the concept of indigenousness, is the heart of our conflict. I tried in this book to explain why the Jews are not only a religion, but in fact primarily a people, or what I would call a people with a religious identity, with an attachment to a particular land. And I was looking for Palestinians with whom I could have a conversation in which both sides would affirm the legitimacy and indigenousness of the other. In that sense, this book is really an experiment, and nothing more and nothing less than a model. I can't bring peace. I'm only a writer. I'm not a politician or a diplomat. But my responsibility as a writer is to try to help create a new language with which Palestinians and Israelis might be able to speak to each other more honestly, perhaps with more compassion, more understanding. And my goal, when I say that the goal here is to create a model, the goal is to try to navigate irreconcilable differences. Because we will never agree on what happened and what, let alone why, in 1948. We will never agree on what happened in 1967. We will never agree on which side is primarily to blame for the collapse of the peace process in the year 2000. So in that sense, how we disagree, the respect with which we manage to disagree, is no less important and perhaps ultimately more important than trying to find areas of agreement. And perhaps a final word to the Jewish audience. What I try to do is give us, the Jewish people, a language in which we can combine empathy for the Palestinians with an affirmation, a forthright affirmation of the integrity of our own story. And all too often, we as a community are divided between one camp, which expresses empathy and increasingly less identification with our narrative, or alternatively, the other camp, which is passionately defending our narrative, but often incapable of expressing empathy for Palestinian suffering and dislocation.
Yusef Bashir is a Palestinian American from the Gaza Strip and the son of Khalil Bashir, a highly respected educator. Yusef made his way to the United States, where he earned a BA in International Affairs from Northeastern University and an MA in Coexistence and Conflict from Brandeis University. Now living in Washington, D.C., he has worked on Capitol Hill and served as a member of the Palestinian diplomatic delegation to the United States. Yusef is an accomplished author, a vigorous advocate of Israeli-Palestinian peace, and a much sought-after public speaker. Rowan Odeh is a Palestinian American. She lived half her life in Brooklyn and the other half in Hawara. Rowan holds a BA degree in accounting from An-Najah National University. She participated in News Story Leadership as a delegate in 2017. Since then, Rowan has worked in expanding financial inclusion for women at Women's World Banking in the MENA region. Afterwards, she went on a fellowship with King's College London and published a research paper on the economic aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Rowan is currently the managing director of News Story Leadership, an organization that provides a leadership program for emerging leaders from Israel and Palestine in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Yossi?
So the book, as I mentioned, was written to an anonymous neighbor in the hope that my actual neighbors might respond. And that's really why this is such a significant moment for me to be doing this with the two of you. Dear neighbor, I call you neighbor because I don't know your name or anything personal about you. Given our circumstances, neighbor may be too casual a word to describe our relationship. We are intruders in each other's dreams, violators of each other's sense of home. We are living incarnations of each other's worst historical nightmares. Neighbors. But I don't know how else to address you. I imagine you in your house somewhere on the next hill, just beyond my porch. We don't know each other, but our lives are entwined. And so, neighbor. We live on opposite sides of a concrete wall that cuts through the landscape we share. I live in a neighborhood called French Hill in East Jerusalem, and my apartment is in the last row of houses which you see as step-like structures built into the hillside. From my apartment, I can just barely see the checkpoint you must cross if you have a permit at all to enter Jerusalem. But I sense the checkpoint's all-pervading presence. Sometimes my early morning routine of meditation and prayer is disrupted by the prolonged honking of frustrated drivers lining up before the checkpoint. Maybe you have been caught in that desperate line. As a Palestinian, you are denied the rights of citizenship that I enjoy as an Israeli. The ongoing disparity between your hill and mine challenges my deepest self-understanding and moral commitments as a Jew and an Israeli. Ending that disparity is one reason why I support a two-state solution. It is just before dawn. I'm in my study facing your hill. The muezzin calls softly, as if reluctant to disturb the night. I wrap myself in a white prayer shawl and sit cross-legged on a meditation pillow. I touch my forehead to the ground, a nod to the call to prayer coming from across the way. In my most intimate conversation with God, I am hoping to speak to you. A pale sun rises over the desert beyond the wall. I bind my arm with the black straps of tefillin, fasten a small black box on my forearm, facing my heart, another on my forehead. Heart and mind bound in devotion. Clearly visible outside my window in a far corner of the sand-colored expanse is an incongruous patch of blue, the Dead Sea. And just beyond the hills of Jordan, I imagine myself merging into the vastness, a part of the Middle East. But the wall restores me to reality, to the constriction just beyond my porch. Thank you very much.
Rowan, you're going to read from your letter, correct?
I am. Okay. Dear Yossi, we are a Palestinian girl from Nablus and an Israeli boy from Jerusalem who met in Washington, D.C. during a program at American University. We are writing to tell you about the work we've begun together. Rowan lived half her life in New York City, and in the other half in what she describes as the absolute opposite of the Big Apple, a conservative Muslim village outside Nablus in the West Bank. This is where she experienced the implications of the Israeli occupation, where IDF soldiers invaded her home and traumatized her younger siblings, where her mother was shot by an Israeli settler, where she first interacted with the other side holding rifles and pointing guns at her at Hawata checkpoint. That made her realize that peace or any other agreement can't be achieved as long as Israel continues its presence in the West Bank and its siege on Gaza. Bar was born in the Negev desert in Kibbutz Bet Kama next to the Bedouin city of Rahat. Growing up, the conversation around his dinner table always revolved around peace, and he believed strongly that Israeli disengagement from Gaza and the West Bank would naturally lead to a separation. As a teenager, Bar was attacked by Palestinians who beat and robbed him, but the most important factor that made it hard for Bar to believe that the other side wanted to end the conflict was the fact that the Israeli disengagement from Gaza did not lead to peace. From that moment on, including during his 3-year army service, Every interaction with Palestinians was centered around violence. Though most of Bar's daily encounters with Palestinians were respectful on the surface, underneath was tension and fear that violence could erupt at any moment. We were inspired by the method you used in your book to reach out to the other side. Your dialogue modeled for us a sincere and unpretentious way of speaking, but each one of us was inspired in a different way. Through your book, Bar reaffirmed his belief that the way to create understanding of the other side is through telling his story and narrative to the Palestinians. For Juan, me, this book is more complicated. Her first response was to see it as a way for the Zionist movement to justify the daily injustices Palestinians endure. But she respects your opinions and understands the importance of both sides listening to each other no matter how much we disagree. This is exactly what your book invites us to do. As a result of your book, we decided to travel to campuses across the US and tell our very different stories alongside one another to students. This book brought us together to create a serious dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis in our 20s. Your book showed us how to develop this method of encounter. We want these encounters to spread not only between Israelis and Palestinians living in the US and other Western countries, but also to bring our approach to Israel and Palestine. If you see yourselves as responsible for helping create a new story, if you believe that the narrative of the other side doesn't undermine your own narrative, then don't undermine the other and say it out loud. Join our movement. We are working towards breaking the barriers that the conflict has created within both people. Thank you.
Rowan, thank you. Yusef, I know that you have a letter as well that to frame this evening, I'd like to ask you to read from that.
Okay, Yossi, it's a pleasure to be with you again. This is our second time now to speak. And you wrote to me and you asked me if I could share my response, to which I was more than happy to do. Dear Yossi, I have read your book with great interest and with an open heart. As the author of the book about my experiences growing up under occupation in Gaza, I appreciate your attempt to reach out to Palestinians. The book that I have written is also a kind of letter to the other side. In fact, I end my book with a letter to the Israeli soldier who shot me in the back without provocation when I was 15. In my letter, I told him that I forgive him and call him cousin. I hope my book comes out in Hebrew because I want my story known to Israelis. After I was shot, I was treated and rehabilitated in an Israeli hospital, where I experienced the kindness and humanity I did not know existed on your side. We have been in contact ever since we spoke together about our books at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. We are similar, you and me. We both have a great sense of belonging. I think that this has been the key to your triumph and to my ardent clinging to the idea of Palestine, a Palestine that I believe should exist in peace and dignity side by side with your country. A few days ago, you wrote to me to check on me and to see how my own book, The Words of My Father, Love and Pain in Palestine, is doing. You mentioned that you had just returned home from your book tour. I wrote back, welcome home. But something paused in me when I wrote that your home is not Tel Aviv. Your home is not in Tel Aviv. You do not even live in West Jerusalem. No, Yossi, you live in East Jerusalem. Your home is land that has belonged to my people for centuries, and the world has promised would return to me since it was seized by the Israeli paratroopers whom you wrote about in your previous book, Like Dreamers. We Palestinians are a people of great passion and pride. When you write that the Jews fought an underground war and expelled the British occupiers, you are effectively denying what Palestinians had gone through at the hands of the British mandate, of the British colonizers. It is often difficult for me to tell you my story, but when I do, I try to tell it to you in terms familiar to you because I truly want you to better understand my narrative. The more we understand each other's narrative, the more of a basis we have to coexist. Our coexistence must not be through denial or separation, but through recognition and integration. And I believe that your book is a profound invitation for such a process. I commend you for that. It is a wonderful thing to be reminded by you that we both proclaim God's oneness, because above all else, that is what's important. I appreciate your connection to God. It brought me closer to your narrative in some profound ways. I invite you to keep on writing letters to the Palestinian people. The people who fashioned my father's words taught me to love, not hate, to never surrender to defeat or injustice, to always stand for peace in the Holy Land, to forgive you for all the pain your people have caused mine, and to say to you, welcome home, Yossi, your occupied neighbor.
Thank you to all of you for sharing those words. We're going to start off with some conversation up here, and then I think we will open it up to hundreds of questions. So what do we have? We have till what, midnight, Thea? Is that right? Okay, so let's not waste any time. Each of you have experiences that you've written about. Yossi, you write about your time in the IDF, having rocks thrown at you and watching people in the IDF experience violence. I suspect you have many more stories. Yusef, you spoke about being shot by an Israeli soldier. You write very movingly about in your book and in a Times op-ed that appeared back in April. Rowan, your mother was shot, as you said, by an Israeli soldier while trying to save her little brother. Her little brother, correct?
Yeah, settler also.
There are all kinds of reasons for the three of you not to be here. All right? And yet, here you are. And Yossi, you write in the book about faith. As a religious person, I'm forbidden to accept this abyss between us as permanent, forbidden to make peace with despair. As the Quran so powerfully notes, despair is equivalent to disbelief in God. To doubt the possibility of reconciliation is to limit God's power, the possibility of miracle, especially in this land. The Torah commands me, seek peace and pursue it, even when peace appears impossible, perhaps especially then. So I'm wondering if each of you can speak a little bit about what gives you faith in the future. What gives you the faith in the future to be here on this bima, on this stage? And asked a little more crassly, how do you get past your baggage that we all carry with us in this conversation?
I continue to be optimistic because of my connection to God. I ask myself over the past, I've been in this country for 13 years now. I have gone all over this country to speak and share my story and my experiences, especially with Jewish audiences across the country. In fact, I just came from St. Louis, Cleveland, and here I am. I feel by the end of the month, I'm going to be Jewish myself. And despite all of that, over the past decade at least 4 wars happened with just Gaza, not to mention Lebanon, other places around the world. And it's the same question I keep asking myself when I pray my prayers as a Muslim, and I ask God, I'm praying, but I still see no peace. And it comes back to the very fundamental concept, which I think Yossi agrees with, is the concept of faith. I choose to believe in God and everything that He has chose to put on this planet, including my friend Yossi, including his brothers and sisters who don't see me as a valid part of the Holy Land. I also have no choice. I watched the Israeli soldiers occupy my house. I watched them disrespect my father and my family, demolish his greenhouses. But I also watched him insist that they and we together are the children of Abraham. And I shouldn't allow the violence to determine what kind of human being I was going to live out the rest of my life. Even when I was shot, my parents told me that you have to use this as an opportunity. It's bad enough that you already got shot in a wheelchair. Now you have to, a choice. You either seek revenge or you seek a new way out of this ordeal. And this is what I have chosen. And lastly, and last but not least, the fact that we are all here together, despite everything that happened and everything that will continue to happen. people still have faith, people still have hope that one day the people who are talking about peace and working towards peace will find a way to make it more of a reality for all of us.
Roman?
I have quite a different story to Yusef. I grew up in Brooklyn, and my parents immigrated for a better life. And when we did, we assimilated. We didn't talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, what that meant for me, except for one story that my mom told me. And that story is mentioned in my letter to Yossi, and it describes a time when she was only 9, playing outside with her younger brother, and 3 Israeli settlers came up to her brother, my uncle, and wanted to attack him. And she did what every older sister, I think, would want to do. She tried to protect him, as naive as a 9-year-old could think. And as she was telling the settlers, "Khalas, leave him alone," one of them took out a gun and shot her. And that was my story. And it's still, the pain, her scar is still scarred in me. And that's all I knew as this young girl growing up in Brooklyn, until my parents realized that we didn't know anything about who we were. So they decided to move us back to the West Bank at age 15. I was furious because of my cheerleading practice. And I found myself in Hawara, this tiny village that was under military occupation. This village where every day I saw Israeli soldiers in and out, on my rooftop, in my home, holding rifles at me as a young person that just wanted to go to school. And there was a moment where I wanted to give up. And then I remembered the feisty Brooklyn girl that I am, and I thought, no, I need to speak up. My story needs to be heard. And so I applied to New Story Leadership, and for the first time, I was sharing my story to the other and to the American people. So what gives me hope? Quite honestly, I do. I give myself hope because I choose every day to stand up and speak up. And with my organization, we give a voice to young Palestinians and Israelis that want to change the discourse, and it's uncomfortable. I'm going to be honest, me sitting here today in front of a Jewish audience is a little uncomfortable. But yet, I decide to sit here and speak to all of you because that's what we have to do. We have to talk and speak up and talk about the inequalities and injustices, because otherwise we'll be trapped in the same story. And that's not something I want to be a part of, quite frankly. I want to create the new story.
I guess it's my turn. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would be on this stage, that I would have written this book, seeking this conversation, I would have thought you were mad. 10 years ago, I was like just about any other Israeli after the Second Intifada. And for me then, as is true today for most Israelis, ask an Israeli who's responsible for this conflict today, who's responsible for the ongoing occupation, and the answer will be unequivocal. It's the Palestinian leadership that kept saying no. And that for me was axiomatic. And I'm a veteran of the op-ed wars, which is one of the fronts with which the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been fought. And that's a necessary argument that has to be waged. But at a certain point, I began to realize that the status quo that set in as a result of my anger, the anger and again, to my mind, the justifiable anger of the Israeli public toward the Palestinian leadership, which did miss some significant opportunities from my point of view. There's an alternative Palestinian narrative about that. But as I think most of you know, the normative Israeli narrative is we really tried to end the occupation. We received 4 years of the worst terrorism in our history. And so Israelis will tell you, if you want to complain about the injustices of the occupation, talk to your own leaders. And I would have said the same thing 10 years ago. What made it really increasingly untenable for me was realizing that for the last decade, we have increasingly lost the high ground because we have stopped placing an offer on the table. The last credible offer from an Israeli government to the Palestinian leadership was in 2009, was Ehud Olmert's offer to Abbas. And again, my narrative, we offered a fair deal, the Palestinian leadership walked away. But that was 10 years ago. Meanwhile, settlements are being built, expanded all over the map, and we are rapidly sliding into a one-state dissolution. It's not a one-state solution. It's a one-state disintegration. It's a no-state. And the only thing that frightens me more, frankly, than a two-state solution, and I'm terrified of a two-state solution, I'm terrified of the West Bank turning into another Hamas-led stronghold. The only thing that terrifies me more than a two-state solution is basically the disintegration of the Jewish majority state. And so that was one motive for me to reclaim this conversation. Another was the realization that I was becoming hardened, coarsened, that I would look over the wall that is outside my window and not see my neighbors. The eye learned how not to see. And maybe that was offensive to me as a writer, because a writer is supposed to see. And I realized that this situation was conditioning me to not see my neighbors. And so the final reason, I would say, that I undertook this book was because I needed to test the possibility that there were Palestinians who would be ready to have this kind of conversation. And I don't know, again, whether this has the remotest chance for bringing peace. I don't know. I don't know what the reverberations will be. But I know that my soul needed this conversation. I needed to find Yusef and Rowan and others with whom I could develop friendships across this wall, with whom I could develop painful and deep conversations for my basic humanity. And so, in the end, I'm seeking out my Palestinian partners for my sake, because I find the ongoing shattering of the Palestinian people unbearable for me as their neighbor.
Yossi, let's stay with that idea for a second about finding people to speak to. Yusef, you write so beautifully about your father. You wrote in the Times, a few months later, in August 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Strip and from my home. The soldiers had occupied that house for 5 years. Now my father was once again able to live freely on his ancestral land. His spirit had prevailed. He had proved to me that violence is not the only option when standing up for freedom and dignity. He had taught me that seeking peace is not only a prayer, but also an obligation. I've since moved to the United States, where I have spoken to many groups about my experience. People need to know that good men and women like my parents do exist in places that are full of war and hatred. They may speak more quietly than some, but they deserve to be heard. So I asked this to you and Rowan about the ones who are speaking quietly. What are they saying, and how can we better hear their voices?
They have for quite a while. They are saying that we, in my household, I read Yossi's book about 4 times now, and every time I read it, I remember my parents and what they were telling me and teaching me about the Christians and the Jewish people in the Holy Land. So everything you tried to share, at least with this Palestinian, sounded very familiar to me. And I'm sure it would have sounded very familiar to my father as well. Those people are there. Those people exist. They speak every day quietly because the world is not paying attention. It's not choosing to hear their voices. I don't know why, but I'm here for the past 50 years or even more. You wouldn't see a Palestinian here telling you, I'm a Palestinian American and here's my story, or Rwan's story, or. You were more likely to hear from Yossi over the past 50 years and his Jewish brothers and sisters, but not from me and not from us. But today, you are also given the opportunity to hear from us about our human experiences, the experiences that we have in reality every single day, living in Gaza, living in the West Bank, or living as refugees across the Middle East since 1948. My parents taught me that the only way forward is to live in peace. You are not only going to make friends with your friends, peace with your friends, but you have an obligation to find a way to make peace with your enemies. And the Jewish people are not exactly my enemies because I share so much with them. This is what I've learned. This is what I still continue to believe, and I will continue to believe for the rest of my life. The situation in Gaza, for example. I'm from Gaza. I'll just focus there. You do the West Bank. And for many Palestinians in general, we are not provided, we're not living in that environment where our intellectuals, our peace activists, the people who want a better tomorrow for everyone are not being put forward. And I'm not going to just blame the Israeli army. I'm going to blame everything the path that we've been put on since 1948. We have been shattered, 500 cities destroyed, wiped off the map. Gaza has been under siege. The West Bank is filled with settlements and settlers and denied so many basic rights that even today Americans are asking about. So the people in Gaza, in the West Bank, are talking, are working, but we now hopefully will bring more, will give them more of an opportunity to express themselves in a human way without blaming the other every single time.
Rwan, this is right in some of the work you do, right? How can we better hear, how can we, the collective Jewish community in North America, I'm not sure how this conversation would be playing in Jerusalem, but let's focus on North America. How can we better hear these voices that are out there, right, that we're not hearing necessarily?
Great question. I'm going to reference again the organization that I work for and kind of highlight the Palestinian stories. I think one of the misconceptions is that there's one Palestinian stories. Actually, there's a million. And we're fragmented because of the occupation and because of the Israeli violence, the conflict in general. This past summer, we had 5 Palestinians alongside 5 Israelis. And on the Palestinian side, we had Thawra, a Palestinian from East Jerusalem, who lost her cousin because he was burned alive by Israeli settlers. And then we had Lana, a Gazan, who lost her best friend filming the protests alongside the Gaza border. And he was a journalist. And she's now studying in Qatar, and her 4-year-old sister doesn't recognize what she looks like. Plain and simple. They Skype and she can't say this is my sister because she hasn't been given the opportunity to return back. And that's a huge part of the Gazan story. We had our West Bank delegate, Mohammed Ahmed, who's 60% paralyzed in his left arm because during the second intifada, his village was a complete siege and he couldn't go to the hospital to get a very simple procedure. These are the Palestinian stories. And I think the biggest issue is they aren't being heard because they don't have access to this platform. I'm sitting on this stage, I am privileged. I'm an American citizen, I can sit here today and share these stories with you. But for millions of Palestinians, they don't have that privilege. And I think that's what's missing. And in the peace-building world, there are lots of organizations out there, amazing ones, that allow Palestinians and Israelis to talk to one another, to meet with one another. But I think, 50 years of looking back and criticizing the peace movement, these alums, these Palestinians and Israelis that were brave enough to step out of their comfort zone and talk to one another, were just that. You're on this peace camp. You make the peace camp look good, but when it comes to real, serious conversations about political process, about reconciliation, that is for the top level officials. And that's where I say, and sometimes I scream, don't talk about us without us. I think that's the biggest thing that I can share with you all today. The American Jewish community, the American community, you play a huge role in what happens to my life back in Hawara. And yet, I don't know. I mean, for most of you, if you've heard a story like mine's before. So what's missing? Hear our stories, and don't just hear them. Do something with them. Share them with your friends, with your congresspeople, so that we're not only on the kids' table of the conflict, but we're working with high-level conversations, and then we feel empowered enough to say, yes, we are the next generation that's going to lead the future. And that's what we want to be, but we need partners across the divide to allow us to move forward with that.
Like the two of you have been doing this long enough that for many North American Jews, I'm not certain how many Palestinians they've actually ever met or spoken to or had candid conversations with. So just even having this dialogue is breaking really important ground. And in about 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to open this up to some questions. I say that optimistically. But let me throw out two statements, Yossi, from an op-ed you wrote back in 2018 and allow each of you to respond. Yossi, you wrote in the LA Times, on the Israeli side, much of the right denies the existence of a Palestinian people, insisting that it is a contrived identity whose sole purpose is to undermine Israel, yet the majority that do acknowledge the legitimacy of Palestinian national identity understandably fear that the creation of a Palestinian state when there's no sign of reciprocity. Speak to us for just a couple minutes about it's only a year later, lots changed in a year. Speak to us a little bit about where you see things now in Israeli society and how we sort of move the needle on that issue, or if it's moved.
I think the first thing to understand about Israel today is that, unlike the American Jewish community, we are not divided between right and left. We're divided between right and center. And the center, the awareness, the understanding of the center has not yet really penetrated the American Jewish community. The left has effectively collapsed. If you look at the last elections, the Israeli left won all of 11 seats, and then another 13 for the Arab list, and the rest of the Knesset is center or right. I come out of the center. I do not come from the left. And so I am very much not at home in the language of the American Jewish left. It is not my language. My language is very much a wariness of the center, which I would say combines the sensibility of the left in realizing that we desperately need a two-state solution, and the fears of the right that we actually can't have a two-state solution anytime soon. That's what would define, in very broad strokes, the center. And so the book is coming out in Hebrew in a few months.
It has not been printed yet in
Not
Hebrew?
yet. It's coming out in a few months. And I was waiting for the Palestinian responses to come out, for the book to come out in Hebrew, because I feel that's the kind of conversation that we need to have in Israel. It will be a very different kind of conversation in Israel than it's been here. And the conversation in Israel, understandably, is framed by the realization that we could find ourselves in a war at any moment on any front, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Iran in Syria. And so when I listen to the two of you, my heart breaks. But that's only one half of me, because the other half of me is thinking about the wider context in which Israel needs to navigate in the Middle East. And so that is the conversation that will happen when this book comes out among Israelis. Is this book naive? Is this book irrelevant? And there are times I wonder the same, I have the same question. So it's been a very interesting experience having these multiple conversations around this book. There's a conversation that I have with Palestinians that's different from the conversation I will have with Israelis. That's different from the conversation I have with the American Jewish community. And each of these conversations require a very specific language and sensibility. And the difficulty for me in juggling these conversations is to try to maintain integrity in each of them while realizing that each conversation has a very different set of assumptions.
Well, that will be an interesting process when this comes out in Hebrew. Let me turn to the second statement you make there. On the Palestinian side, one of the great obstacles to peace is accepting that the Jews aren't just members of a religion, but a people. In conversation with Palestinians at every level of society, I've repeatedly heard the same refrain: we have no problem with you as a religious minority, but we can't accept your invention of yourselves as a nation. To Yusef and Rawan, is this an accurate statement? And if so, what are some actions on the ground that can alter this landscape, all right, to begin the process of seeing the Jews in the land of Israel as a nation, right? That level of acceptance?
Some people would say that's the million-dollar question. I mean, when I think about that statement, what first comes to mind is my 9-year-old brother who's now 16. And during Eid al-Adha, a holiday that is celebrated by Muslims where we sacrifice lambs and cows, sorry to the vegans and vegetarians out there. During that time, he was playing outside with his cousins, and clashes happened a few miles away. And as a result, the IDF invaded our village and arrested all the kids, including my younger brother. And when the IDF jeep approached my house, I was in shock. Like, okay, is this really happening? And when they came out, I ran downstairs and I told them, you can't do this. He's an American citizen. And then I stared at myself for a second and I thought, that's a crazy statement. No, you can't do this because he's a 9-year-old. But that didn't matter. It didn't matter that he was 9 or an American or playing outside. He was still arrested. And instances like this, I wish I could tell you they're rare, but they represent the everyday reality of living under the occupation. So that's the problem. That's the problem that Palestinians have with the Israeli army. And I think that is something we need to fix so that the conversation can then move on to reconciliation and trust. It has, to me personally, and I think to a lot of people, it has nothing to do with the Jewish people. I think it has more so to do with the daily injustices that paint the picture, represent what it means. I mean, for me to see my younger brother behind bars, that broke my heart. I think it would break all of your hearts. We can all fundamentally agree that's not okay. And I think that's the missing piece. And I will also add that, in the West Bank, 67% are the younger generation, my age, go millennials. And for us to be productive parts of the conversation, to be open to reconciliation and the peace process, it's not a hard concept. I think we don't have the opportunity to do that because there are walls and separation and checkpoints, and I don't know the other. The first time I met an Israeli was in the United Kingdom, for God's sakes. Although I'm like a few miles away from them. And I think that's also the problem. It's hard for us to think about the other when the other is the enemy. And how do we break that? I think through stories. I shared stories, we all did. And unfortunately, back home, we don't hear the stories. We only hear the football matches. And I think I hear it also in the USA here too. You're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, but I think no, let's be pro a good process for everyone getting their rights and getting their statehood.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you. So we're going to open it up to some questions, and just a little rule we have here at Park Avenue Synagogue. Typically, questions end with a question mark. Right? We're going to try to stay away from political statements. We're going to try and stay away from long speeches. There is an off button on the mic, which the person's holding. So let's ask questions and let's engage in the same kind of civil dialogue that we've seen modeled up here on this bima. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and we'll start here in the front, okay?
I read in an Israeli newspaper today that there might be elections in the West Bank. So might I ask the two Palestinians present here, what do you think might be the outcome of that election? Question mark.
I also heard that, so I've heard a lot of conversations about the PA speaking with Hamas officials, and I think if there are going to be elections, it won't be only in the West Bank. I think the ideal is to unite the Palestinian people, and that means including Gazans and including East Jerusalemites. For me to think and conceptualize that now is hard, right? I haven't seen elections in quite a while as a young Palestinian, but with every process, I'm hopeful. What will happen, I think only God knows, honestly. But if there are, I hope to see that. I think we all do, right? I think it's important that the Palestinian people unite in a democratic process. But I think, I'm reading the same news that you are, quite frankly. So we both will be on the lookout with the outcome.
I'll add one more thing. I left Gaza when just around the time we had the very last elections that I've witnessed in my lifetime, which was the 2006 elections, in which many Christians and many women throughout the Palestinian society chose to vote for Hamas because they wanted to try a new party, a new a group, a new politics. The other guys corrupt, they didn't deliver, so many more things. The problem is when Hamas won, Jimmy Carter was there, the UN was there, fair process, democratic, unlikely in the Middle East to see such a process happen. Overnight, every newly elected member of the Palestinian parliament was arrested, dragged out of bed, straight to Israeli jails. So today, even I wonder, and I hope that we will manage to pull it off, have elections in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. I'm actually very proud that no matter what, we still try. No matter what, we still find a way, and we still give hope into this process of democracy and voting and and elections. But even given that the wrong party wins in the opinion of my neighbor, there's the state of Israel, what happens then? So I'm always concerned that the expectations of my neighbor go beyond the expectation of my very own people. And that's always going to be an issue, whether I have elections tomorrow or in a month or in 10 years. The Israelis have to accept all of us because that's who we are. We're not just one opinion. We're not two parties. We're far, far more than that. We're very much complex, just like the Israeli society is. So that's the fear when I hear that we are attempting to do elections. I'm worried that what if we vote the wrong party that Israel sees as the wrong party? What's going to happen then? Because I know what happened last time. Gaza was effectively put under siege, that it still continues to this day. And not so, my people did the right thing. They voted, they participated in the democratic process, and in a lot of ways got punished for it. And I hope that doesn't happen. I do very much hope that we still manage to do elections nevertheless.
Yossi.
Yeah, so Yusef, I'd like to quote a very wise friend, Yusef Bashir, who said a little while ago on this stage that we don't only blame the other side, we also look at our own shortcomings. And I think there are deep, deep problems politically within the Palestinian planet, and the same on my side. And I would say that you have too few elections and we have too many. And so maybe we can find a happy medium somewhere.
Yossi, I think you just had the quote of the night right there. That's a good one. Yeah, we have a question over there.
Thank you very much for being here tonight and for all of the efforts you are making to try to find peace. Where do you think Hamas currently fits into the search for peace? And where do you think Hamas should fit into the search for peace?
I mean, unfortunately, there isn't a Hamas representative on the stage to answer that question. But I think from the Palestinian perspective, often we get that question a lot, right? Like Yusef and I are on this stage explaining the younger generation and what we see as the answer and how we're working towards, and we always get thrown into Hamas. I don't know where Hamas fits into it. I do think that no matter what, the peace process will have to ultimately include the extreme of both sides, because if only the moderates and the left sign a peace agreement, unfortunately, that's not a peace agreement, that's a ceasefire until the next conflict. So I think whether we all like it or not, they should be included. Where they stand today, I mean, just looking at the news, they're meeting with PA officials for the new and upcoming hopeful elections. So to wrap up, I think they're a part of the Palestinian fraction, whether we like it or not, but to give them too much energy, I think we need to also acknowledge that extremes has to be brought in, and we can look at the Irish conflict. I mean, the IRA was in the peace process, and there's no other way, because how else can you get peace if you still have spoilers on both sides?
Yossi, since there have been some questions about elections, I just want to ask if you could give us, this could be an unsurmountable task, give us a brief summary of where you think, what does each possibility mean for the peace process? If Gantz forms a government, if Bibi forms a government, what are we looking at practically? I know you can't, you don't have a crystal ball, but what's being said on the ground here?
So really, just to speak as broadly as possible, no matter who forms a government, to my mind, the objective conditions on the ground are not ready for a resumption of the peace process. The question is, will there be an intensification of the annexationist process, or will that be stopped? If Gantz forms a government, or if there'll be a unity government, then the role of the center will be to make sure that settlement expansion is contained, and that the possibility of a two-state solution, at least, is still maintained. If the Likud forms a narrow government, but I don't think that's really possible. I think we are most likely looking at a unity government. Certainly, if the Likud comes to power again, then we're heading in a different direction. But I think it's really important, and again, this is something that I think the American Jewish community needs to be paying greater attention to, and that is the regional developments. And I'm thinking specifically about the Iranian threat and how it is bringing together Israel with the Saudis, with the Gulf states, with other parts of the Sunni world. And I'm mentioning that in the context of the peace process, because in Israel we used to speak about peace happening in the Middle East from the inside out. And what that meant was, first we make peace with the Palestinians, then we make peace with the region. The thinking in Israel today is that peace is going to happen from the outside in. We're going to solidify our relationship with the Arab world, or large parts of the Arab world, and that can help reassure Israelis about our place in the Middle East, about Israeli security, and that can have long-term implications for, I would say, regalvanizing the Israeli majority that existed before the Second Intifada, to seriously consider a two-state solution.
Thank you. Where are we with the mic? Yep.
This was touched upon a little bit earlier, but this question is directed to Yusef. You mentioned earlier today that in 2005, when Israel pulled out of Gaza, your father's soul was able to be at home finally and free. And then you also mentioned, like 2 questions ago, that the election of Hamas was something you viewed as a democratic process, and it was refreshing for Palestinians to finally engage in a democratic process to elect their own leaders. When I view the pullout of 2005, I view it as painful, as I'm sure Yossi also did, and then I also view the election of Hamas as something that I'm not sure, I was very young at the time, not necessarily feared, but the increase of terrorism at the time.
Let's get to a question, please.
The question is, how do you view the 2005 pullout and the election of Hamas?
Before the pullout, my house was occupied by the Israeli soldiers who were stationed at the former settlement of Far Darom from September of 2000 until August of 2005. Every day, that gigantic house, we had to sleep in the living room. I had to ask for a permit from the soldiers to go to the bathroom, kitchen. I was a teenager at the time. That's what I talk about in the book. I had to negotiate with the soldiers whether I could stay home late, come home late, play soccer outside. Not my parents. My parents were focused that we are not going to leave. We're not going to abandon our house because one day the soldiers will leave. Eventually, that's what happened. My father thought it's about time that this is going to take over the entire area and we will get into continue the peace process. The Intifada will be over. The Palestinians will be satisfied. Their rights will be met. The Israelis, their concerns, their expectations will be met. Obviously, that didn't happen. You're asking me what happened when Israelis pulled out. I saw that the Israelis demolished all of their greenhouses, destroyed all of the houses that were Okay, people. Let him speak, please. I was there too. I've been living there for 350 years. Okay, let me tell you something. You don't have to love me. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just telling you what I saw, and that's all I'm going to do tonight. When the Israeli army left the Strip, 1 year effectively after the Israelis left the Strip, they never let go of Gaza fully. So even though my father was free to go upstairs for the very first time in 5 years, he wasn't able to leave whenever he wanted. If he wanted to go to see my brothers in Germany, if he wanted to take a vacation in Egypt or all of that, it was still very much effectively controlled air, sea, land by the state of Israel. So yes, they left Gaza on the inside, but they never left Gaza from the outside.
I would just like to clarify something of the dynamic that's happening, because I think it's useful to understand exactly the point where Israeli and Palestinian narratives diverge on making peace. And earlier, Rowan, you were asked the question about Israel's legitimacy, and you responded understandably by speaking about the pain, the trauma of your family. And Yusef, you've done the same. From an Israeli perspective, the blockage over why there is no peace is clearly related to the question of our legitimacy. And what Israelis say is, listen, you're expecting us to leave the West Bank, which is the last strategic territory that we're holding, which borders our population centers, in the most dangerous region on the planet. Show us, at the very least, some goodwill. Show us that you're ready to accept our legitimacy. And that, from my point of view, is not just a logical position, but an essential one. The Palestinians have no less a logical and an essential position, which is you're asking us to recognize your legitimacy. First, take your boot off of our neck, get out of our homes, literally or metaphorically, and then we'll talk about legitimacy. And so that's the point where we speak past each other. And so we will say, well, look what happened in 2005. We withdrew, Hamas comes in, the rockets start. So yes, of course there's a siege. This is exactly where we begin to speak in circles. And my position is very close to some of certainly your position. But I think it's really important for the kind of conversation that we're trying to have tonight, which is rare. It's all too rare. And that is that rather than go over once again the arguments, and those arguments are precious to me. They're not abstract. They're my life as an Israeli. Nevertheless, what I'm trying to learn in this conversation is some measure of restraint, which requires listening. And even if I disagree deeply with the way that you lay out 2005 or how you lay out the conditions for moving forward, I have to listen. I have to hear you. And I have to hear you with respect and as much as possible with empathy if I'm going to ask you to listen to me. That's the dynamic. That's really the dynamic that I hope we can see.
And I think, Yossi, when you start to hear the mumbling in the crowd, right, about challenging facts, and
I understand.
I understand it as well. It's one thing to have this conversation up here and listen, and I think that gets back to your point about how will this play in Israel? How will this play in the West Bank? How will this play in Gaza? Right? Will people be willing to have this kind of conversation with so much baggage?
Yeah, the last point I'd like to say is that I've been, in recent months, in the position that the two of you are in, which is sitting in front of a hostile audience. I've sat in front of Palestinian audiences. And it requires a great deal of courage for the two of you to be here. And I just want to
Friends, we are going to wrap up, and it's inevitable that there will be many hands left in the air. I think, Yossi, that you just really gave us a great point to end with. If you just give me 1 minute, I want to thank everyone up here, Yusef, Rowan, Yossi. It is we should not take for granted this conversation, because it doesn't happen everywhere, and it takes courage for all of you to be up here. I want to end with your words, Yossi, which I think can take us into the night with feelings of hope and anticipation for the future. You write, both our peoples are warm and generous among ourselves, but we show our hardest face toward each other. Instead, we need to draw on the deep resources of our faith and see ourselves as inseparable parts of a shared sacred story. That shared story begins with our Father, where we begin this week in Lech Lecha, Ibrahim's revolt against idolatry, smashing his father's graven images and proclaiming the oneness of God. And through that radical insight, the oneness of humanity. In cherishing the legacy of our shared Father, we partake of that seminal moment of the birth of a new human consciousness. And we share the longing for a world liberated from idolatry in all its forms, from all the clouds, our perception of divine reality. Both our traditions note that Ibrahim was buried by Isaac and Ishmael, who overcame their rivalry to honor their father. Along with conflict, that too is our legacy. So is our Father's generosity. Perhaps the memory of his hospitality can help us find a way to accommodate each other's presence in this land. Ken Yehi Ratzon, as we say, it should be so speedily in our time as we continue this elusive search for coexistence and peace. I want to thank all of you again for being here this evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. And we're especially pleased to remind you that thanks to a generous matching gift from the Cayley family, every new or increased dollar you donate to JBS will be worth double to JBS. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.